Okay, hello everybody, and this is a happy 50th birthday to Resurgence, but also a nod in the direction of the ecologist, and I think of both of them very fondly. And preparing this, I was thinking very fond thoughts of Teddy Goldsmith when I first met him. And indeed, I have just over there in the corner of my room, I have the first copy of the blueprint for survival. And I asked Teddy, you know, you got it wrong. The world hasn't imploded. And he turned, paused, looked, and then we drank a glass of wine and he said, I think it's too early yet. And he was right, because things have got worse very dramatically fast. I'm going to talk very quickly, and I've done a whole series of slides, which I shall go through fast, to basically ask a very important question. What's the function of a state if it isn't to ensure that its people are well fed? And secondly, I'm focusing on Britain, not because I think Britain is that important, it happens to be my country, but I think it's extremely important as an illustration of what not to do and what should be put right. So I'm going to give you a flavour of some of the arguments that Georgie very kindly referred to, that I've fleshed out in considerable detail in my book, which came out the week of lockdown, sold out in a week, and is coming out in paperback. It's Penguin next year, but I can save you the bother of reading it. Essentially, this first slide, I hope is seeing it. Britain doesn't have a food policy. Bits of it do. Scotland and Wales have begun. England hasn't got one. It began to develop one in 2007-10 with the commodity crisis, in 2007-8 when oil prices and food prices on world markets doubled, and suddenly the G7, G8 rich world suddenly said, my goodness, you know, we're in a dangerous situation. And to their credit, the Labour government, which had previously just said, leave it to Tesco et al., said we've got to sort something out. So for the next 3 years, there was an extremely interesting and important development ending in January 2010 with a national food policy signed off by the Prime Minister. And to their shame, the coalition that came in abolished it all. And now they are, you know, the Conservatives are in now, I think, are wrongly and shamefully saying they're now doing the first strategy for 75 years. It's not true. There was a very good one, all developed on all the boxes that the current government is thinking some about. And I'm not saying that as any way party political favouring. They were both really bad. I think Britain has a real problem, and that's the core argument in my book, that the evidence for doing something very dramatically different is very strong, but is policy and is behaviour and our actions getting that change? No. We're in a bad place, a big gap between what the evidence says and what we're actually doing. And in red, I've highlighted my struggling to understand, why is this? Thinking about my own country. And I've concluded it's basically these four things. It's that we're still dealing with an imperial legacy of the arguments that went on in 1815 to 1846 and ended in the triumph of the free traders that said, let others feed us. We don't need to feed ourselves. We don't need to bother. We'll just get food where it's cheap. So cheapness has been very important, and that was important in the past. It's less important now because actually all food is expensive and all food is too cheap. And in that sense, there's a social distortion that we're not dealing with. And we now have this modern reflex, which is leave it to markets, which in fact means leave it to the powerful, leave it to Tesco et al. And in the last 40 years, we've been dominated by a sort of a neoliberal model of consumer choice, and that's inadequate. Which consumer knows the carbon footprint or the biodiversity impact of their food or of a meal when they go to a restaurant? You haven't a clue. Just to say buy organic doesn't do it, frankly, and I speak as an ex-organic farmer. So the big issue is what I put at the bottom. What do we really want from our food system? Britain, I won't go through this, has an extraordinarily idiosyncratic history. We teach our students on our unique masters that Britain is a very interesting example of a country which could take the risk because it basically decided in 1846 to not feed itself and it then had 100 years of being hit in the stomach, literally. And I've listed some of these. And it joined after the Second World War, the rebuilding of food systems, did it in one way, but then joined another way by joining the European Union. We've now left that, and we still don't really know what we're doing. The agriculture bill is going through Parliament at the moment, but it says next to nothing about food. We're now actually waiting for a national food strategy for the English, which the very nice Henry Dimbleby is leading, but we should have it in place now, and we're not. And that 4 years of wasting time is, I think, something we're going to regret. Look, I don't need to say to an audience here, the evidence that the UK food system is in trouble is very strong indeed. I've just highlighted it. My book, I spell it out at length, but lots of it doesn't need spelling out. The ecosystems are stressed, and food is a major driver of it. The food economy is not paying the full cost of food. Food is cheap, but it's expensive. It's expensive, but it's being sold as cheap. Too much food is what we call ultra processed. The British eat the most highly processed diet of any country in Europe. Over 50% of our diet is ultra processed, meaning high in fat, salt, sugar. So you get a frozen pizza. It looks like a pizza, but is it what a pizza would be if you went to a peasant society? No. Our culture is in fantasy land. We can eat what we like, when we like, from where we like, 364 days a year. The advertising on food is almost all for ultra processed and sweet fatty foods. And it's about 0.7 of £1 billion. If you look at the health expenditure on health promotion in Britain, it's about £10 million a year. It doesn't matter which way we look at it, there are distortions. And the critical issue that's emerged in COVID-19 is this underbelly that people like me have passionately been exploring and indeed exposing for the last 35 years. Britain, under all governments, and it's now got really bad, has a terrible food problem of food poverty. If you were just to say strategically, yesterday I was talking with people in Singapore. Singapore is an island nation, doesn't feed itself, only gets about 10% of its food from its own landmass. It's not got much landmass to grow food. Britain is actually not in a good place. This is the Economist Intelligence Unit review of global food security, comes out every year. Britain is 17th out of 113 on availability, affordability, quality, and safety. On the bottom right, if the EIU includes sustainability, meaning environment, Britain drops even further to 24th out of 67 countries. So even on a very flat audit, food security ain't so good in Britain. But we're now in this very tricky politics that I rather badly here have called a multi-whammy. We've got Brexit, where we're leaving where we get nearly 40% of our food from. COVID-19 is disrupting the biggest employer in the British food system, which is hospitality. Climate change, biodiversity loss, the geopolitical uncertainties. Does the Conservative government really want to become 51st state and not get food from the European Union, but get it from Florida? Well, you know, that's tricky, but that's okay, it's its choice. You know, this is not a good time for disruption in the food system, which is why, in a way, I have never seen in my life, and I'm old, I've never seen the British food industry so worried about the threat of no deal Brexit, ever. What do we mean by food security? Boring academics like me spend months, years on this. There are many, many definitions. I think in real terms, we're talking about, do we mean nationalism? Do we mean self-sufficiency? Do we mean being able to defend it? If you want to get your food from America, well, dead easy to disrupt, actually. You know, if there's a war, or if China wants to get aggressive, or Russia wants to disrupt it, it becomes much easier to do. Is it about food control? Who controls it? Is it corporations, or is it people? Is it about this interesting notion of resilience, being able to bounce back, the ecological notion of resilience? Is it about dealing with risks? Is it about making sure you've got the capacity to do things? Is it this peasant idea of food sovereignty, that farmers are in control of it? Or is it all of those, actually? These are interesting ideas. I'm not asking you to plump for one of them or t'other of them, but they're all important with very different implications. If you really want to deal with these, you've got to start doing what are over there on the right-hand side of the page. In short terms, if I had 2 minutes with a minister, or preferably with the Defence Committee of the British Parliament, I'd say we have a badly defended food system. We aren't resilient. It can't show any bounce back. In particular, as we have seen in COVID-19, the social resilience is very weak. And I think that's partly a problem of lack of food democracy. We've got a highly centralized food system. 5 companies dominate retailing. It's a very concentrated system, whichever sector we look at, other than, funnily enough, hospitality, which is just currently being broken apart. In 1939, this map was done for the Minister of Food to say, where does the food come from? We're in the middle of there. And I love this map. I put it in the book because there was the minister who came in of food, an ex-retailer, and he said, holy Moses, we are entirely dependent upon these long supply chains. Actually, Britain at the moment doesn't have a big dependency on long distance supply chains, but I hear people in the government who think, well, we don't need to get food from Europe. Well, that's interesting. Or they're ignoring the fact that tariffs, according to the food retail industry, will go up by 22%, 22% if we have a no deal. That seems to me really critical. Now, the modern version of it starts becoming, it's that table over there on the right. This is government's own figures. I only use government's own figures. And government actually has different ways of calculating food. Those are the actual figures of what they say the sources of food are. It's about 50, sometimes 55% from the UK. About a third of it comes from the European Union, and then this spread across the others. But if you look on the left, there's this slow decline of production. The much hated Common Agricultural Policy actually increased British food production from about 60% of supply in the 1950s to 82% by subsidies. And the subsidies have gradually been cut back and supply is going down. Now, we've got to decide, does that matter? Well, over on the left here, I think it does matter. That Dover and the Channel Tunnel, in other words, the same 5 miles apart, is where the vast amount of British food comes into Britain. I exhaustively looked at all the ports of Britain. It's all written in my book at great length. Okay, I was doing a strategic food defense, food resilience analysis of Britain. And basically, if it wasn't, there is a private army which controls the Channel Tunnel, a private army. It's not a state army, a private army is the security bulwark on the Channel Tunnel. This is a very risky, and if you're bothered about Ireland and Northern Ireland, by the way, Holyhead, and I have family near there, I see these flows of trucks going in and coming out. Basically, this is why the Northern Ireland peace deal is so important, and why there was such fury and upset and anxiety, delete where necessary, over the internal market bill currently pushed through Parliament. And this is a very old-fashioned way. This is, again, government data of looking at the food system. Basically, over time, as the British public has said it wants more British food, it's got less. The gap between what is imported and what we export of British food has grown wider and wider. It's what we call the food trade gap. It's now about 25 billion pounds a year. It's growing wider. So something very strange is going on for if one's bothered about food security. And here, forgive the detail on this, it's just to show you that I know what I'm talking about. Essentially, Britain imports all of these foods with the one exception of beverages, and that's whiskey. Basically, whiskey is exported. Whiskey and biscuits and meat is what we export. But even in meat, we import more meat than we export. So on a balance of trade sort of analysis, which if the free traders and the gung-ho Brexiters really want us to become global Britain, well, we're not in a good place. So we've got to start doing something about it. It seems to me, I'm a policy man, we're really facing some big philosophical choices. Down the left-hand side here, I've tried to summarize, and again, I go through all of these in my book. You know, is Britain an Atlanticist? Does it want to really become 51st state of the US? You know, there's some who think, well, let's join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, really? I thought we had the Atlantic, not the Pacific. But anyway, some of them really do, and they're serious about it. Some are globalist. Just they don't mind where the food comes from. It can come from any. Others are what I call neo-imperialists. They want the Commonwealth to start feeding it, a bit like the Empire used to until World War One brought us up short, and then World War II made us change our position. Others say, well, we don't need to get food from Spain or Portugal. We'll be outer European. We'll get it from Tunisia if they stop killing each other, and Morocco and Israel, and you know, outer Europe, and Turkey. You know, these are big options for where one would get the big deal, which is fruit and vegetables. It's fruit and vegetables that we import vast amounts of because we have a piddling-tiddling horticulture industry. Now, if you don't know it, the fabulous Zero Carbon Britain project that the CAT did, the Centre for Alternative Technology under Dr. Paula Allen, and chaired originally by a Nobel Prize winner. On the left is basically a square box that shows you what British food is, British land is used for. Land for food is in orange. I've ringed it. If we wanted to be zero carbon, which is what their project has been about for 7 years, and this is the last study they produced, we basically have to double the land to start growing food for us, using land very differently if we want to be zero carbon. And in one table here, I've summarized it. This is from my book again. Britain has, the UK has 18.7 million hectares. Of that, about a third of it, 6 million hectares, is what we call croppable. Things can be grown on it. About 4.5 million acres of that is arable, but horticulture is this piddling-tiddling, almost infinitesimal hectarage of 165,000 acres. Hectares, sorry. This is ludicrous. We are entirely being fed by countries like the Netherlands and Spain and so on, who have chosen to invest in and look after their horticulture, and we're using them as an empire instead of using our own land. This is a big philosophical choice we have. And here's partly why we don't just need to be thinking about carbon and measuring our sustainability, but things like water. I don't know about where you're living, but I live in central London and I have family in North Wales and all over the place. It's been pouring everywhere. And yet we're importing water, embedded water in foods. And this is a lovely study by Tim Hess and Chloe Sutcliffe at Cranfield, who are doing great work on embedded water in foods. Huge amounts of water being imported in food when we actually should be using ourselves. And the bottom right is, for me, a very moral issue, that we're actually bringing water from water-stressed countries. I was brought up as a child in India, so I'm always interested. I love Indian food. You know, the more we import rice and dals and things like that, we're importing embedded water from other countries which are indeed water stressed. It's time we grow up, basically, I'm saying. If I'm a policy analyst, if we look at where is the British state, well, you know, we teach our students at City University, you know, the defence budget in the current time is about £41 billion for the next 2 years, 2020 to 2021, and environment is about 2 billion. Actually, most of that money, by the way, the big sections of my book, is going on nuclear submarines, which frankly are not very useful. We've only got about 5 or 6 of them for if you want to defend the food supply chains. And if you start looking at the border force and patrol boats and things, we've got tiny amounts, absolutely tiny amounts of defense. I can't go into that here, but if it interests you, there's lots of detail about that. Meanwhile, we know Britain is an unhealthy, bad diet eating country. It varies. The rich always think they're doing fine. They're not. almost all Britain isn't eating enough fruit and vegetables. And we know that if we start altering our diets, eating less meat and dairy and becoming flexitarian to pescatarian to vegan to vegetarian to vegan, the improvements actually happen. I'm not saying one should be vegan. I'm not vegan. I'm flexitarian. But the moment you make a shift from the mainstream UK diet, that's over there on the left, immediately the footprint of what your diet is, its impact on phosphorus, nitrogen, water, cropland, and greenhouse gases changes. Actually, if you become more, if you break away from the current diet, water use goes up. That's why it's critical to say, whose water is it? Which is what I was raising in the previous slide. Meanwhile, the economics of British farming is all over the place. We criticize the common agricultural policy, but we're actually still not clear. Do we want to carry on subsidizing our farmers? This is the figure of the income. It's what the Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food used to call TIF, the total income from farming. DEFRA calls it that now. These are the TIF figures for the last 25 years, from 1993 to last year. Essentially, the blue charts, the blue bars are the income in real terms, but the red is the subsidy. That's you and me paying farmers about £3 billion a year. Now, the government leaving the EU is saying, okay, we'll carry that on until 2024. That's only 3 years ahead. And after that, we'll start reducing it and only pay you for environmental gains. And I just say gently, what about food? What the heck's the point of land if it's not about growing food? So are we actually being pushed by an environmental policy that all sounds very nice and hunky-dory? Let's be nice to biodiversity, of course, but we're not doing it at the moment. And just to pay farmers for ecosystems ain't going to deliver food security. Meanwhile, land prices are rocketing up. Meanwhile, we have a highly concentrated land ownership over there on the right. And actually, I'm almost finished. This is the perspective that I think we need to have ahead if a country like Britain really wants to grow up and neither retreat to a neo-imperial approach, nor be sort of go into a lager mentality. We've got to have what in academic terms we call a multi-criteria approach. We've got to juxtapose health, social values, quality, environment, economy with the governance. And getting all of those right, the sweet spot at the middle is sustainable diets from sustainable food systems. So if I have 30 seconds with a minister, and I have done this, this is what I say. There's no point just saying, okay, for the future, the British food policy, agricultural policy is going to be about the environment. What about health? What about the economy? Are you getting rid of all the other industries? What's happening? So my 3 minutes with the minister, as opposed to 2 in everyday Daily Mirror language, would be big changes are needed in supply, land use, food for health. We need sustainable dietary guidelines, where we give pretty weak nutritional guidelines at the moment, which aren't being followed. They need to become eco-public health, not just public health guidelines. We've got to get a grip of markets. The money flows are dreadful. Farmers and primary producers, fisherfolk and growers get about 8% of the gross value added of food. All the money goes off the land, where it's a very big fight between very often very powerful forces in manufacturing and retailing. In catering, it's slightly different, although in contract catering, 2 companies dominate contract catering. Food infrastructure is one of the key messages for me. One of the things I wrote at great length in my book, I spent a lot of time going through the National Infrastructure Commission, which doesn't talk about food at all, and yet is 50 years ahead scenario, is realizing that floods, damage to roads, railway, etc., but they should be looking at food as infrastructure. We need to be planning a more decentralized, more regional food system, in my view. I was born in Lincolnshire. It's like the Netherlands. A lot of it's below, or the food growing bits of it are or horticulture growing bits are below sea level. These are going to be highly stressed. We've got to be planning very fast in the next 20 years for food defense and food resilience reasons to start spreading horticulture across the country as opposed to having it highly concentrated. And I think that means civil awareness and the social resilience is urgently needed. And you're probably not aware of them, but under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, there are these bodies called resilience forums. For 2 years, I was arguing before this crisis we're in at the moment of COVID-19 that the resilience forums should be dealing with food. They're not. They're not dealing with it adequately at all. So I think we've got a big agenda. We're in a very interesting place at the moment. There are some interesting possibilities at the moment, but it's not looking good at the moment. So I'm very sober. So I think fondly of that first discussion I had with Teddy Goldsmith and many I've had with Satish as well. But I think we know enough about what we could be doing to get the sweet spot of sustainable diets from sustainable food systems like that.